Namaskar and welcome to Indian Diplomacy, show about India's foreign relations, India's important partnerships around the world, the ways in which India is engaged with key stakeholders to solve global problems, and also India's major challenges and how it deals with them in cooperation with important players. Viewers, in this episode, we are looking at a menace that has stalked India for a long time. It's a global scourge. This is terrorism. We are going to be looking at terrorism, the way recent trends have developed, in how they have impacted on India's national security, as well as the wider global context in which it's happening. And to take us through this discussion, I have a very special guest in the studio. Let me introduce you to Professor Tricia Bacon. Professor Bacon is Associate Professor at American University in Washington, D.C. She has worked in the U.S. State Department before being in academia, and is also the author of a very important co-author of a new book called Terror in Transition. It's a study of terrorist organizations, their leaderships, and their dynamics using case studies from around the world. Professor Bacon, it's a pleasure to have you here.
I'm honored to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
So to start with, I mean, when we talk about global terrorism, major trends lately, it's obviously a major threat to international peace and security, and there's no doubt about it. And whenever, if you ask an average person anywhere in the world, including in India, they would think about, Islamic State or Al-Qaeda, and these are the images that come to mind the most when we talk about global terrorism. And these groups, Professor Bacon, they have ebbed and they've waxed and waned over the years, and at times it looks like they've been beaten through comprehensive counterterrorism operations and measures by various countries, but at other times they seem like they're ascendant and they're rising again. Mm-hmm. So what makes them so resilient?
I think you raise a really important point there, which is some of these organizations have appeared to be defeated at multiple points, only to resurge at a later time. There's been declarations of defeat of the Afghan Taliban at one point, at Al-Shabaab, the Islamic State in Iraq, only for those organizations to resurge later. I think Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State in particular have been particularly innovative in how they've maintained their relevance and been able to come back from setbacks. And I think one of the key things they've done is forge this network of alliances that you talked about. Al-Qaeda really pioneered that affiliates approach, as we call it, where it has essentially franchises around the world. And it did it with a select number of groups, and those were very well-established organizations. They're organizations that are in many ways self-sufficient.
Locally based.
Locally based,
yeah.
In Africa, in the Arabian Peninsula. And it took established organizations and formed relationships with them to carry on its name. So when the core, as we think about it, Al-Qaeda core looks weak, some of the affiliates are still strong and able to perpetuate the concerns and the threat. And then the Islamic State took a very similar approach, but much more sweeping. It has a quantity of alliances all over the world. Some of those organizations are not as strong as others, but again, now that the core is weak in Iraq and Syria, it has these affiliates that can continue to carry on the threat and to conduct attacks that then make the news, and it's able to tout.
And they graft the global or universal jihadist ideology onto local causes, it seems, because that's how they're able to have buy-in and traction in all these different regions of the world.
There's this interesting debate about how many of the groups are really local and how many are transnational, and I think what we really see is that those two things come together, and that these groups remain local in what drives them in their recruitment and their attacks, but they graft this broader narrative that the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda propagate about a worldwide cause to their actions locally. So it's a very dynamic combination of both, and it's very successful, and it's very hard to defeat as a result.
And presumably they're able to do this because of the communications revolution, right? In an earlier era, you couldn't be sitting in the mountains of northeastern Syria, for example, and directing operatives in Indonesia.
Yeah.
Now with in fact, the UN reports consistently point out to the use of new technologies by which they're able to exploit and break the traditional barriers of sovereignty and statehood and just penetrate societies and go very deep and radicalize young people.
I think that's true. And I think the additional thing that social media allows them to do is take attacks that have happened locally and tout them to a global audience. For example, we saw attacks in the Congo that at one time or another would be occurring. But now that this is an Islamic State affiliate, the Islamic State claims those attacks. And so they get a much more attention and they have a much more terrorizing effect. So they can use it to radicalize and recruit and to tout the actions that they're able to take.
Viewers, international cooperation is a very important element in counterterrorism, and I want you to hear India's External Affairs Minister Dr. Subramaniam Jaishankar speaking at a special briefing of the UN Security Council about the need for international cooperation and the lack of it, and which is a major problem. We'll continue after this small clip.
The international community holds a collective view that terrorism in all its forms and manifestations must be condemned. There cannot be any exception or any justification for any act of terrorism, regardless of motivations behind such acts. We also recognize that the menace of terrorism cannot be and should not be associated with any religion, nationality, civilization, or any ethnic group. However, in spite of the progress we have made to tighten the legal, security, financing, and other frameworks to combat terrorism, terrorists are constantly finding newer ways of motivating, resourcing, and executing acts of terror. Unfortunately, there are also some countries who seek to undermine or subvert our collective resolve to fight terrorism. That cannot be allowed to pass. In our own immediate neighborhood, ISIL Khorasan has become more energetic and is constantly seeking to expand its footprint. This should be taken seriously. Events unfolding in Afghanistan have naturally enhanced global concerns about their implications for both regional and international security. The heightened activities of the proscribed Haqqani network justifies this growing anxiety. Whether it is in Afghanistan or against India, groups like Lashkar-e-Toiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed continue to operate with both impunity and encouragement. It is therefore vital that this Council does not take a selective, tactical, or even a complacent view of the problems we face.
You as External Affairs Minister of India asking the international community not to be tactical or selective about counterterrorism. Professor Bacon, this, of course, at the highest level, if you look at the UN system as well as major multilateral and bilateral channels, there is a lack of sufficient cooperation, and as Dr. Jaishankar was saying, there's also a lot of politics wherein terrorist groups are proxies for some states. Terrorist groups also indirectly are abetted by some other states for geopolitical rivalries in order to settle scores or to just to repress the rise of a rising country. So these kinds of problems really you could do a grassroots analysis of why counterterrorism may not be succeeding in a particular country or region. But then if you look at the global picture, there is clearly a need for greater cooperation and coordination, and that's not coming through, despite the fact that this the jihadist menace especially affects almost every stakeholder, but still they tend to view it as, this is not my problem, this is X's problem or Y's problem. And this is how I think we seem to be failing to come together as one international community.
I unfortunately can't argue with the points that you've made and that you've outlined there. I think that perhaps in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, there was hope that there would be this broader global coalition. And even in the case of the efforts to counter ISIS, there was a broader coalition than we've previously seen for that kind of specific organization. But that is specific to an organization. And so in some ways, it doesn't take on that broader strategic effect. And I think that you're absolutely right that countries look at the concern about jihadism, but then they start to selectively look within that about which groups or which aspects of it are the greatest threat to them, and that the other organizations are not taken as seriously. So there isn't that kind of cohesive approach. And I have to admit that I don't see that changing as the near peer competition, particularly concern between the US and China, India and China. I don't see that diminishing as that becomes maybe the dominating ordering principle of the international system, whereas counterterrorism really was a dominant concern for many years. And if we weren't able to accomplish it under those conditions, I'm even less optimistic that we'll accomplish it now.
Well, it is a gloomy scenario and we have to be realistic about it. But Professor Bacon, the other question is about bilateral cooperation. I mean, you're right that the larger groups are not coming together on one page because of their internecine rivalries and contestation. But between like-minded countries, for example, US, India, you worked in the State Department. This is where I think there is potential a lot more.
Yeah.
So we are doing intelligence sharing, there's also defense cooperation, there are also joint exercises of armed forces to better hone their skills for counterterrorism operations, and I think they are passing on tips about locations and hideouts of terrorists, and in some cases maybe even joint operations to neutralize terrorists. So that is where I think it looks like the universal cooperation model is not there, but bilaterally with India, for example, US is a major partner now, Israel has become an important one, France, and a few other neighboring countries in the Indo-Pacific. So that seems to be going well, and perhaps that's the only realistic way forward.
It does seem like this kind of cooperation, at least when we get down to the operational level, is much more a bilateral relationship. There can be these broader strategic coalitions that maybe have joint statements or that express certain sentiments. But when it gets down to the nuts and bolts of counterterrorism, that really does tend to be a bilateral, in part because it involves sensitive information and sensitive intelligence and sharing that information, sharing sensitive capabilities. So I think that is the primary mode of cooperation, is the bilateral cooperation. That isn't to say we give up on regional or we give up on a more global approach, but at the end of the day, that seems to be the core of counterterrorism efforts.
US, India in particular, Professor Bacon, what all are we doing and what can the public know about it? Because we have a 2+2 ministerial dialogue, we have a comprehensive strategic partnership, and counterterrorism is an important agenda point. It's not only counterbalancing China. I mean, nowadays people tend to think of US, India only in that frame, but there is also the threat of radicalism and extremism, and beyond South Asia as well. So what all are we doing? What more can we do?
I think there's been a lot of progress in the U.S.-India counterterrorism relationship when we look over the past 20 years. There's been certain pivot points. 9/11, of course, is one. The aftermath of the 26/11 attacks that have really brought the two countries.
American citizens were killed. They were victims.
Absolutely. And the FBI deployed here and tried to assist in the investigation. My understanding is very effectively. That was a very effective working relationship. And so there does seem to be good link-ups with the State Department and the Ministry of External Affairs, with the FBI and with the internal services here, with our external services. It seems like there is good link-ups at the different organizational levels that work on these issues. And some of that are broader working groups, and some of those are the nuts and bolts of sharing intelligence that's of mutual concern to the two countries. So I think this is a bright spot in the relationship. It's not one that maybe gets as much attention, in part because of the rise of the concern about China and the alignment there, and in part because of the nature of some of this cooperation just being fairly sensitive. So I think sometimes this is underestimated as a pillar in the relationship, but I think it has become that, perhaps gradually over time, but it has become such a pillar.
Yeah, viewers, there was a time when there was a lot of hand-wringing in India that the US is not doing enough to curb the Pakistanis who sponsor cross-border terrorism. But I think now it's nuts and bolts. What Professor Bacon is talking is very important, and that's actually the way forward in terms of practical action to counter and liquidate terrorists. But also important is the regional context, and this of course complicates matters because the US has relations with other countries in the neighborhood, in South Asia. And there was a lot of disappointment in India when the Americans left Afghanistan in a very chaotic fashion. It was a disaster. And ever since, there are a lot of skeptical voices in India that the US just doesn't do enough for us, and it's a self-interested actor. but I suppose so is India and so is every country. So within the realms of possibility, can we forge a broader counter-terrorism coalition, you think, or can we will it have to be limited just to the bilateral? Because there are countries in the region like Bangladesh that are affected. Sri Lanka had major ISIS attacks just a few years ago. Places where you wouldn't think Islamist extremism or jihadism is a problem, it's cropping up. And the region remains tense. Maldives, a small little island nation where there is a significant number of young people who've gone to Syria and Iraq to fight and have come back. So American strategy to the region at the broader South Asia level, perhaps there's more we could do collectively?
I think there is more that we could do collectively, but I do think that reality is tempered by the shift in the United States to focus less on counterterrorism and more on this broader strategic competition with China. And in fact, that is one of the main reasons the United States left Afghanistan in the manner that it did, was that it wanted to take this step to focus more on China and to extract itself from the commitment in Afghanistan that had really consumed a lot of U.S. resources and attention. And so I think that there is an important place for counterterrorism in the region going forward, but I don't think it's going to be the top priority to the degree that it was in the intervening 20 years because of these broader strategic dynamics that have changed.
And on that, Professor Bacon, many countries have kind of marginalized or reduced the salience of terrorism in their national security strategies, the US itself being a case in point. And increasingly the reversion to traditional conventional geopolitical rivalries seems to be a bigger priority. So are we committing enough resources or attention that this problem requires? Because there has been a backlash against excessive counterterrorism. People saying that you've been obsessed with it and get out of it now. You have to counter China. So do you think there's still enough attention and resources being given to counterterrorism, or should we be doing more?
I think you're right that the pendulum has swung too far against the amount of resources provided to counterterrorism, because the reality is that the jihadist threat overall has not diminished. It's simply evolved and changed in the ways that it is operating, especially in regions like Africa. And one of the things to remember about counterterrorism is if a major terrorist attack does occur in the United States, and it does occur in India, that will derail the efforts to focus on China, because there will be a reaction and it will have to consume the resources in order to determine what happened, to respond, to prevent future ones. So making sure that counterterrorism remains enough of a priority, that prevention is at the forefront, while understanding that there's this broader strategic shift, is a very tight balancing act for both the United States and India to play. And I worry a little bit, at least in the United States context, that the shift away from counterterrorism means we may not have that balance quite right.
Well, that's a very important point Professor Bacon's making, that if we don't have the terrorist problem under control, then how can we concentrate our forces and energies on counterbalancing authoritarian rivals? I mean, that's always the question, right? I mean, and on this point, viewers, I have a very interesting report.
Motion in the UN to designate Lashkar-e-Taiba terrorist Abdul Rehman Maki as a global terrorist. Jaish-e-Mohammed terrorist Abdul Rauf Bazar was saved from sanctions in August. And now, 2611 mastermind Sajid Mir has also found assistance from the Chinese. China has blocked a joint India-United States attempt to blacklist Pakistan-based terrorist Sajid Mir under the 1267 Al-Qaeda Sanctions Committee of the UN Security Council as a global terrorist. China defends its actions as so-called technical objections based on procedural loopholes. However, it is an open secret that they have a clear pattern of protecting Pakistan internationally. Beijing's actions expose its hypocrisy and double standards when it comes to the international community's shared battle against terrorism. Political considerations, unfortunately, prevent the Sanctions Committee from achieving their intended aims, thus derailing the efforts to fight terrorism. At the UN Security Council briefing on Ukraine's fight against impunity, India, while taking aim at China, strongly cautioned against the politics of protecting terrorists. Diplomatically, China has provided almost unwavering support for Pakistan at the United Nations. Meanwhile, Pakistan assumes that their friendship is as sweet as honey and as deep as the sea. And to prove its loyalty to Beijing, Pakistan has forfeited territory and sovereignty. Pakistan, facing economic and political uncertainty, has relied upon Chinese loans. China is enjoying many benefits under its Belt and Road Initiative in Pakistan. However, it seems that the real impetus behind Pakistan and China's relationship is in attempting to keep their common rival, India, off balance.
Viewers, you just got a glimpse of the politics in the region. India's two main adversarial neighbors in tight collusion, and in the process, you have a situation where they're getting away with blood on their hands. Professor Bacon, India, US, we have tried to push hard, but the Chinese have always stymied these efforts and have delayed them. In fact, you go back in time, the names that people of India remember the most, Maulana Masood Azhar, now this guy Abdul Rahman Makki, all of these are most wanted in this country because they have the blood of so many innocents on their hands. And yet the Chinese dilly-dally and come around to make sure that Pakistan is not embarrassed and make sure that Pakistan can continue with its proxy war against India via terrorism. So this collusion has become a major point of in fact, contestation between India and China, because they have a broader rivalry. But on this matter, India's sovereignty and territorial control of Kashmir is at stake, and which is being challenged by terrorists from the Pakistani side. So this is where, your thoughts on what can India do about this? We've been protesting to the Chinese. We've shared evidence. They've asked for more evidence of a proof of Pakistani terrorists. We've given them enough evidence, but still it's a cynical game. And at the end of the day, I think the Chinese are pretty happy with the way things are because they don't have a direct threat from Lashkar-e-Taiba or Jaish-e-Mohammed. And so I think their notion is let the Indians, remain in trouble as long as the Pakistanis can keep them in trouble, and that way we can check India's rise on the world stage.
I can't argue with that interpretation of events. I think that the positive thing I would say about this is that there is an area of U.S.-India cooperation in trying to move the UN Security Council on this, but I actually don't see a lot of room for maneuver here by China. I think it's committed to this position. I think there have been moments of intense political pressure after attacks that China has briefly shown a willingness to provide some support for these, but as a general policy, it is going to protect Pakistan from these. And I'm not sure that this is a question of how much information China has. I think this is about those broader strategic concerns. At the same time, I think China has facing some pretty serious security problems in Pakistan. And it, of course, is deeply concerned about its own potential for extremism. So it is trying to take that segmented approach that you and I talked about at the beginning as unproductive, fundamentally, where you try to slice up the militants as ones that are acceptable and ones who aren't. And ultimately, as we see with the security situation in Pakistan, that can be a very self-defeating policy.
Even in Afghanistan, after the Taliban takeover, it seems like the Chinese had some kind of a deal saying that you don't, export terror into Xinjiang and to the rest of mainland China, and in return, we will try to work with you. But it doesn't seem to be, so the Chinese seem to be playing with fire as well, because they've got some of these dreaded groups that can come back to bite the hand that might feed them. And like you said, many of their projects in Pakistan under the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor have been bedeviled by terrorist attacks. Chinese nationals have been repeatedly killed in Pakistan in large numbers, and terror attacks against Chinese citizens in Pakistan have become norm. So in spite of that, it looks like they're not able to see. Ideally, we would like China and India to cooperate jointly to wipe out this menace, but it's not happening.
No, it's not happening. And as the level of competition increases, or at times when the level of competition increases, I think it's even less likely to see that be the case. I'm not sure that the United States or India has the levers that are needed to dissuade Beijing of this policy. So I think this is an area where we share interests, but we lack leverage to change.
So to conclude, Professor Bacon, this threat in South Asia and beyond, what is your assessment? It seems to be on the rise. The UN reports after the fall of the recognized government in Kabul, especially, the fallout is huge. And ISIS has become much stronger and more active now. Its branch here in this region. So going forward, you see that what is the trend line you see for this decade going forward? I think given the logjams with the geopolitical rivalries that we spoke about and the inaction of some vested interests, looks like at the end of the day, internal security and counterinsurgency, counter-terrorism, which is within our control of the affected country, that probably is the basic bread and butter of counter-terrorism, right? Because there's a limit to how far the international community can help India, because we have to help ourselves, and we have taken a robust counter-offensive measures against Pakistan after major attacks in the Narendra Modi era. So more such probably actions is the need of the hour, because we can't actually rely on this unstable international configuration beyond a point.
I think that's true. I think there's two dimensions of counterterrorism. One is the defense, of the ability to protect your territory. And I think the United States and India have both invested significantly in that. And that has helped explain the relatively few significant terrorist attacks in recent years. And the other is to weaken the capability of the organizations that seek to attack you. And in the case of groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, we do see some diminishment of capability. But on the other hand, we are in South Asia, in a region where you have two states that provide safe haven to terrorist organizations, in the Afghan Taliban and the Pakistani government. And that creates an environment where it's very hard to maintain a reduction in the capability of organizations. When there's safe haven to meet,
Guests
to
of the
train,
state. Yeah.
yes, that provides something that is that really no other region has. Although we do see, of course, concerning developments in other regions like Africa, there's no other region that has the same configuration as South Asia in terms of having that degree of safe haven for militant groups.
Absolutely. So viewers, state-sponsored terrorism remains a persistent challenge for India's security. And what this discussion brings out is international cooperation does bear fruit and is necessary, but then there are, in a self-help world, when you are attacked, you need to take robust counter-offensive measures of your own. Professor Tricia Bacon, thank you so much for sharing your insights with the audience. It's been a pleasure.
It's been an honor to be here. Thank you so much.
So folks, think about terrorism and counterterrorism in all the dimensions we have laid out for you. It's a complex issue. It is going to be a dangerous decade the way it's shaping up, especially after the return of Taliban in Afghanistan. And so we've got to be on the watch out and never get complacent. As our Prime Minister says, this is an evil we have to fight, and it's a struggle we have to wage consistently and over the long term. I'll see you again next time with another episode of Indian Diplomacy. Until then, take care.